you, and I got you this one, Robin. Yeah, you learn what lights action camera mean around here, don't you?
All right, we are recording.
Yeah, we're ready.
All right, I'll stand here and you can sit down. Okay, I want to thank you everybody for coming out to CALEXIT CON 5.0. Before I get any further, I want to acknowledge that we are on Toe Vanguard. This was their land first. Okay. So, we just saw a presentation from Hannah Miyamoto on how California can achieve international recognition, the role of international recognition, and the role of climate change and related to that. We're going to have a panel right now of different people. Poka Hannah from Hawaii Sovereignty's here. He's been experienced in the legal cases for achieving international independence. Matt Owens has extensively traveled the border to parts of Mexico and here, and is very familiar with the legal case and illegal case for how America took over California. Hannah's a lawyer, originally from Hawaii. She studied the Hawaii sovereignty, she studied California sovereignty, she studied Baja sovereignty, and she has extensive experience in looking into how to achieve international recognition. My name is Marcus Ruiz-Evans. I wrote the book California's Next Century 2.0, which was reviewed by James O. Goldsberg, who is a recognized writer for Foreign Affairs Magazine, the premier foreign affairs policy magazine in America. And he said that my book had some good ideas. That was in 2012, many years ago. Since then, I've traveled around the world, and I've continued to make a case for California independence. So just to summarize, some of the arguments that we're going to be looking at that we in the movement have been talking about for years and for months on how to achieve international independence, so far, in my opinion, and will be up to the panel to discuss, revolve around roughly three strategies. Number one, as we've seen in the case of Hawaii and Alaska, both of which were interviewed here at the CALEXIT conferences, and Alberta, also interviewed here, was to say that the vote that forced you to become a state was illegal under international law. So that vote was not inclusive of everybody. People were kicked off the voting rolls, intimidated, threatened, banned from voting. International law does not recognize that as legitimate. So some people have picked up on that and said, well, if you didn't even have a legal vote to have me join, then legally I'm not joined. And there's a thing called the International Court that I can go to and say, hey, you don't think it's okay when people disenfranchise and set up fake sham votes like Russia and Crimea, then why is the one that America did in California or Hawaii legal? You're going around saying you can't do that, that's not legal, that's not democracy. Well, you did it here. So why do we accept that when you say it's illegal whenever other people do it? Because it happened in the past? So there's a statute of limitations on justice? Okay, well then I guess we should just stop talking about Tibet being free from China because it happened in the past. Let's just get rid of it. And let's stop talking about Puerto Rico being independent from America or even having the right to vote because it happened in the past. And let's stop talking about New Caledonia having the right to vote because that too happened in the past. So there are inconsistencies in the application of international law when it comes to recognition and independence. And that is an opening for us because California had all the Latinos shot who disagreed with being taken over. Free African skilled sailors who were living here as part of the Spanish Empire were not allowed to vote, or the indigenous, or the Latinos, or any Asians, or any Jewish people. And then they said that's a fair vote. It's not. So that's one option to look at on how to achieve independence. The other one is the one that I've been primarily pushing, which is you say, we want to have a vote to leave. So you hold a vote. Here in California, we've already filed multiple initiatives showing how we legally can do this in California using the initiative process, where we simply ask Californians next time they vote, do you want to become independent? Yes or no? under international precedent, when we look at Scotland and Catalonia or Hong Kong or any other modern successful or quasi-successful independence movement in the last 10 to 15 years, they always have a plebiscite. A vote saying, yes, the people here want to do this. It's not just someone's opinion. We can do that here in California. We've already filed multiple ballot initiatives. No, we didn't get all the way through to the vote. But the point is that we were legally able to do it, and the California government did not say you couldn't do that. Ever. By the way, one of the people who approved that was Kamala Harris. You might have heard of her. So she said that's legal too. Anyways, we have a vote. We get Californians to say that we want to leave. That compels our California legislators to go to Congress and ask for permission to leave. That is typically the way that it's seen to successfully leave, is to get permission from the parent government. Here in America, we have Texas versus White, a legal decision, which said you can secede with, quotes, consent to the states. If anybody has any doubt how 35 to 45 states think about us, I would suggest that you watch two cable news networks. One's called Fox News. The other one's called One American News Network. And just take a look at how they talk about us and, take a peek at, what they say about us. They hate our guts, and they would be just fine with us going. In fact, 4, not 1, not 2, not 3, 4 different allies or colleagues or whatever you want to call it, henchmen of Donald Trump have said publicly that they think it'd be a great idea to kick out California from America. He's president right now. So I want to point that out. That is an option. We could get American votes. We could get the vote here to go. That's another way to go. Finally, the third one is what could be called asymmetrical federalism. So when you look it up in policy journals, asymmetrical federalism, meaning not symmetrical. And what they mean is that certain areas essentially have more freedom and rights than the rest. So when we look at Canada and you look at Quebec, Quebec has more rights than the other provinces. When you go to Russia, there are separate oblasts, which means province, and they too have independent, more freedoms than the rest, such as Siberia. You can also look at India. India too has certain regions that have more rights than the others. England also has done this with Scotland. Spain has also done this with their regions. And so we have Canada, England, Russia, India, Spain as countries that are stable, roughly, most of them democratic, and do practice asymmetrical federalism, meaning one region gets to have a little bit more than the others, and they haven't collapsed. Oh, Brazil does it, by the way, too. So this is not like it's rare or nobody did it in the past. So there are multiple countries that have done this. It's a workable system. It's happened. Maybe we could pursue that here in California. The California National Party has always pursued that angle, as opposed to Yes California, which has said, have a vote. California National Party said, let's gradually push for more independence. They are joined by Professor Alison Holmes, seen here. Dr. Alison Holmes at the University of Humboldt State in August was the first professional scholar in California to ever talk about the idea of California gradually becoming more independent or gaining more rights or pursuing a Scottish model. And she's saying, hey, secession's crazy, but doing like Scotland did, where we have more of our own rights, say we get to do our own immigration and trade policies, and no other state does, maybe that is workable. What they're building on is that California is already asymmetrically federal right now. We are the only state that gets to do our own separate insurance policy. We're the only state, until I think the last few months, who had our own climate change policy. We're the only state that has our own stem cell policy. We're the only state that for the last 50 years had our own air quality policy. We were one of a few states who said, we don't care what the federal government does, we're going to do our own marijuana policy. That's asymmetrical federalism. So while officially it's not enshrined, and the former President Barack Obama called it a, quote, gray area, meaning who knows how to adjudicate over that, we're doing it, and it's happening. So gradually move Scottish-style devolution You're still part of it, but you have more freedoms like Quebec. Full-blown independence. We're going to leave because we had a vote and you voted to let us go. Or we're going to sue you in international court, demand that the vote that you had for us to be state is redone because the last one you did was illegal. And when you hold that vote for us to become a state, what if we vote we don't want to do that? Well, then we're instantly independent. Those are the three that I've seen. I'm not saying that's it. A couple last little bits. This is the World Economic Forum. Basically, it's a showcase discussion of all the top world leaders. They are already talking about how California is now the world's largest economy and that California already acts like an independent state. So when the WEF is talking about it, there's a lot of big countries already acting like you're independent. California has its own climate summit. The reason that I bring that up is that we talk a lot about the Paris Climate Conference in that Trump pulled us out of it. The other thing that's interesting about the Paris Climate Conference, I think in 2014, 2015, was that the French government made two tables for Americans. One for the official federal government and one for the California government. They had a separate table just for California at that Paris Climate Conference. Barely anyone ever talks about it. And they go, okay, you can have your Americans over here and we'll have Californians, you can sit here. And that table was a little bit closer to the front stage. Because they recognized that we aren't America when it comes to climate change. That was 2015. That was before Trump. Paris basically acted like we were a separate nation. Then we can forward to last year. Politico magazine wrote an article called Jerry Brown, President of the Independent Republic of California. And what he was talking about was that when California, in the age of Trump, traveled to Germany for another climate conference, the German government had 18 limousines and diplomats come out to meet the Californians when they came out. Huge carpets, lots of people singing, and oh, you are welcome, and we are receiving you nation to nation. And then Donald Trump or the federal representatives came later on that day, and the German government only sent out one limousine and two representatives. Almost like they were saying, we recognize you, California, as a separate nation and one we prefer better. That was last year. So I would like to point out that when France acts like California is an independent nation, and Germany, and you're already getting to where you have major powers on the world stage saying we recognize you. So the Guardian newspaper, which is one of the premier magazines in England, also recently said that they felt that CALEXIT is more plausible than Brexit.
Whoa.
Whoa.
Yeah, there's the headline right there. Okay. So, that's England. That's another Security Council member that said that. Look at that. That's where they said that. So, the Guardian, California's secession actually much simpler than it seems. British secession actually much more complex. California is arguably in a stronger position than Britain to make this leap. They said it. And just to show that we could get permission, here's a little sampling of different conservatives saying, we hate you Californians, go ahead and leave. So I'll leave it at that. With that, I'll turn it over to the next person to share comments on either what I said or what Hannah said. Matt, do you want to?
Yeah.
Come up here and.
Oh, okay.
Come up here and speak, and I'll take your chair. We'll play. You have to scoot out of your chair, and come up here, and I'll take your chair.
Okay, here we go.
Dan, can you hand me my jacket, please? My jacket's over there.
Well, given the
Oh no, that's not my jacket. I got a suit jacket. It's over to the camera.
just the plethora.
Just sorry about that. We can wait for a second. Look at Poka, right? Poka.
And if you could,
That's me too. I'm like,
Marcus, could you hand me that Universal Declaration copy? Thank you. Hello, everyone. We've had some fascinating insights from our panelists today. on the subject of the international recognition of California's independence. And amongst the topics that sort of tie this together, one is, well, how do we actually achieve it? And the sort of negative example that we're given was the successful liberation of the United States from the UK and the unsuccessful liberation of the Confederate States from the United States. Okay, and how different the perception was of the United States, where actually there were a lot of Brits that were in favor of independence as a way of weakening the Tories, versus the Confederate States that everybody knew was about slavery, despite the apologists saying to the contrary. And you look at the actual 19th century propaganda emanating from the Confederacy, it was all about slavery. So we have that, and I would like to offer both of those as negative examples, because even though the United States succeeded, it did so at a terrible cost of blood and treasure. They had to fight a war, something we don't want to do. Because you look at the United States and how they did that, and they needed the help of their former enemies, the French government. And what was interesting and worked in their favor was that both the French government, which is an absolute monarchy, and French progressives who were against that monarchy, both of them, for very different reasons, supported the United States independence from the UK. Okay. Well, if we had to go that route, we would have some real Hobsons choices to make. Okay. Because the governments that would most likely support us as a way of countering the U.S., the Russian government, the Chinese government, not only don't they share our values, they don't share one another's values. Okay, the Russian Federation government, the government of the PRC, do not share one another's values, nor does the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is strictly a de facto kind of thing. They believe they share common interests, not common values. Okay, and so that would be like what it would be problematic vis-a-vis, the French connection of the U.S., because there were people there who did share their values, and there are Russians and Chinese maybe who do, but that's not a matter of the governments. The governments don't share our values, and they don't share each other's values. It's strictly a calculation based on common interests. You go to Europe, and the Western European governments share some of our values some at a time, and some at a time they don't. Okay? They turn as blind an eye as the U.S. government does to the attempted genocide in Yemen. They're on the side of the Nakba in Palestine. They support coup regimes and other repressive governments that aren't necessarily coup regimes in many other countries. Okay, and they're on the same side as the U.S. So unlike the Russians and the Chinese governments that are totally independent of the U.S., the independence of the EU government is at times very badly compromised. Yeah. So what would happen if we went to them and they says, oh, we think that's a great idea, but, our NATO ally kind of vetoed it on us, so sorry, thanks, but no thanks. Okay, so if we were to have to, if the U.S. were to force us into the same Hobsons Choice as the British government did, the American colonists, it would go badly. We want to avoid that, if at all possible. But there's another counter-example right north of the U.S., the Canadian example. Okay, Canada didn't gain its independence through a war. As a matter of fact, right at the very beginning, they had to fight 2 wars of independence against the United States. And they had to accept, they were co-founded by refugees from the United States, from the losing side, of course. And so right at the very beginning, they had the, sort of the counterblast of the U.S. independence. Okay, they were on the losing side. And took over areas that had been French colonies, and before that, of course, sovereign nations of indigenous, and made Canada. Okay, but when it came time to, this is my counterexample, when it came time to change their relationship with the UK, they did it gradually. Okay, not that gradually, but it came in phases. First, there was passed in Westminster the British North American Act, which authorized Canada to form a parliament. This is before they ever thought of allowing the Irish to form their parliament, the Dáil. Okay. They allowed Canada to form its parliament under the terms of the British North American Act and to put most of the place together. Newfoundland wasn't part at the time. Okay, but most of it. And the very first act of the Canadian Parliament was called the Responsible Government Act. Oh, actually, may we? Because the Responsible Government Act made the cabinet of the Canadian government responsible to Parliament, not to the sovereign, the king or queen. This is something that hadn't happened in the UK yet. Okay. The cabinet had to pledge allegiance to the queen or the king, okay, before they were authorized to operate on behalf of the British Parliament. Canadians beat them to it. Okay, 1867, by the way. You had the British North American Act, the Responsible Government Act, that set Canada out ahead within the British Commonwealth. They were still within the British Commonwealth. They still shared the same sovereign as the Brits did, but they had their own autonomous parliament. Okay, this is the first time it happened. And then it happened in Australia, it happened in New Zealand, and the very last place it happened was Ireland. Okay, and they had kind of a fraught thing where they had the Free State, and you had to pledge your allegiance to the Queen and all that until they broke with that. Okay, so independence doesn't have to necessarily mean war. Okay, and having to go out and find foreign allies who may or may not share your values. Okay, so we have, as was mentioned, we've exercised some of the autonomy of a sovereign nation already, as far as the international covenants that we choose to follow and the U.S. doesn't, like the Paris Accord, the climate change. And, we can expand that ambit of other things that the U.S. doesn't accede to, but we could. Okay. A couple of examples. This is probably the most outstanding one. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not part of the canon of law in the United States. Okay. This means nothing in U.S. law. Nor do the treaties, the twin treaties of civil, political rights, and economic and social and cultural rights derived from this, have any standing in the United States. The U.S. never signed. We could. Okay. The Rome Statute, establishing the International Criminal Court, not the International Court of Justice, which adjudicates things like the sovereignty of states. No, the International Criminal Court that derived from the tribunals in Nuremberg and Tokyo as its examples. Not only does the U.S. not recognize its jurisdiction, they're threatening to arrest the judges and prosecutors. Think about that.
Wow.
They are threatening to arrest the judges and prosecutors if they set foot, including going to the United Nations. Okay, so they are basically contravening the Vienna Statute on diplomatic protections. Okay, going from The Hague to the UN falls under the Vienna Convention on the Protection of Diplomats, and they're ignoring it. They ignored it when they tried to grab Ed Snowden off an Ecuadorian plane in Vienna, where the convention was signed. Okay? They had the Ecuadorian plane on the ground in Vienna, and they says, we're going to seize this plane and look for Ed Snowden, who wasn't there, of course. Okay, he was still stuck in Russia, poor guy. And he wasn't there. Of course he wasn't there. Rafael Correa had been to Russia and was in some, state-to-state talks, and he had offered asylum to Ed Snowden the same way he did to Julian Assange. Gave it to both of them, really, but he didn't have them aboard the plane. So when the plane was down refueling in Vienna, the Vienna PD went in illegally, violating the Vienna Convention in Vienna, looking for Ed Snowden. He wasn't there. And poor Rafael Correa, he got home to Quito and he kissed the ground and he says, "You would not believe what just happened." Okay. So the U.S. is a rogue state. Let's make no mistake.
Yeah.
It is a rogue state.
Yep.
And unfortunately, at the moment, the United Nations is stuck in it. Okay, until they decide to move, maybe back to Geneva, where the League of Nations was, maybe to their first home out here in San Francisco. Okay, but that wouldn't be a good idea unless we are liberated from the United States. Okay, in which case we can secure that. So thank goodness it's not a predetermined thing, except maybe by them, that we have to go to war for our independence. Because like I say, we'll be faced with huge Hobsons choices if we do. Okay. Maybe we'll get lucky and be able to follow the route of Canada's independence from the UK. That would be the lucky outcome. That would be the desirable outcome. And again, we have various mechanisms that we're looking at. We're looking at a plebiscite on independence. We're looking at the possibility of going to the International Court of Justice on the Hawaiian model. And, I will honor them by calling it that. That we were annexed illegally to begin with. And so we can have the ICJ reject the legality of our annexation. And then we can turn around and present that ICJ judicial opinion to the UN General Assembly for their action. Okay, at the same time that we're running a plebiscite campaign, at the same time we're doing the other things. That's the beauty of this movement. It's a movement of different organizations with different approaches that we all run at once. Okay. And, it's like I drive for Lyft and Uber, whichever gets me, first come, first serve. Same thing here. First come, first servicing our liberation. So, there are a lot of things that we can do where the United States is distinguishing itself as a rogue state that we can say, not California. Okay. And particularly not if we're reunified into a Gran California. No way is something that's going to be even larger than the economy of Russia, which we are now, larger than the French economy, which we are now. If we reunify, our economy begins to catch up with that other reunified country, Germany and Japan. And they're going to try for that. They really want to upset. We have as many Californians, even just here in Alta California, as we have Canadians. Really? We may have a larger economy of Russia, but being so much smaller than they are, we don't have to defend, we don't have to spend what they spend on defense. We can do it cheaply and easily. We hope we don't have to make those Hobsons choices. We hope they'll let us go peacefully. Thank you.
Hey, Matt, can you take my seat? And Poka, do you want to go next? And then Hannah?
Okay.
All right, Matt, take this chair.
Actually, if I go where Poka's at, it might be easier for
go
Poka.
where Poka's at. Oh, go this way. Go this way.
Oh,
You're going
okay.
to hit the cord.
Oh, okay.
Wait, I wish I had some paper that would write with.
Well, if we're going all behind everything, it might be easier if I sat between the doors before. Oh, yeah.
Ready?
Yeah, you're on.
Okay.
Thoughts,
Aloha.
feelings?
It's quite difficult to follow this presentation because it's such a vast area to talk about. I'm going to try to hit each of the points just with some remarks. Please realize that I have not had the time to put the remarks in a more appropriate order. So I'm going to follow our first speaker and try to respond to those comments and then make some comments with regards to the second speaker. I think I would want to begin with Mahatma Gandhi's statement that the challenge that we have is to bridge that chasm of hypocrisy between a national creed and a national deed. And what we find is that the United States has consistently been hypocritical about their national creed if we examine the national deed. That is a continuing challenge. And so, in terms of the international arena, that is one particular area that we need to work with. And in working with the international arena, there are certain areas within an international arena, one with nation states, and they are the audience in which we need to make a convincing argument. And yet we caution that nation states oftentimes operate out of self-interest rather than the national creed or the international creed as well. And yet we cannot talk ourselves into defeat. We cannot be our own prophets of doom. And we have to believe in the principles that we are arguing for. While it is true that oftentimes nations will gather around their particular interests, but as you aggregate these nations, generally they will begin to move towards the process of decolonization, as we have seen since the beginning of the so-called new international order, starting from 1945, the creation of the United Nations, in which you had approximately 50, I think it was 54 nations that were members of the United Nations, independent nations. And they all operated out of self-interest. But there has been a gradual bend towards greater justice. And that is that today you have about 190 something members of the United Nations. And the majority came out of the process of decolonization, either one way or the other way. So let's not lose faith in these higher principles that we like to argue for. The other area that we cannot leave out of the audience is a non-governmental organization. They have very much influence, and there really is no separation between official action of governments and non-governmental organizations that influence the government society. So your civil society needs to be contacted and influenced to move the direction. So the rules with regards to piracy, rules with regards to slavery, rules with regards to colonization itself, declaring these principles as international law violations. These are international criminal acts. How do they get passed if the nations are only concerned about their self-interest? It is because as you aggregate national or international interests, they will tend towards that direction. It takes time, but let's not lose faith in the movement of humanity constantly improving itself. And the third is intergovernmental organizations, very important within the international arena, and that includes the judicial systems in the international arena. And organizations such as the International Red Cross or the Commission on Prevention of, the Return of Refugees, and I don't know all of the names of them. But these are effective organizations that we must get behind and support to bring about the justice for what is happening throughout the world. So that's one area of how to overcome the hypocrisy of national governments. And that, I think, we need to be clear in our own minds that that is where the challenge is. Second approach that had been suggested is
a vote, a plebiscite, California to vote itself out, is there a right to divorce? Where? And that's a major question within the United States. The issue of whether or not you can secede from a union. And they say that, well, it's established law. The U.S. Supreme Court has said it often. You cannot secede from the United States. And we've settled that issue. We've settled that issue. How? By a civil war. Is that the way you settle issues of constitutional nature? By going to war and claim that this is a logical, appropriate way of resolving this issue? And that you need to bring right back to that question, the right of divorce, the right of people to self-determination. And reopen that question. Don't let it get settled in that way. The underlying question there was not one of really secession. The underlying question there was one of slavery, inhumanity. And we need to come face to face and raise that and say, no, it wasn't settled. It wasn't settled. So yes, there is a possibility, but the question when you have California voting itself out is the question of who is a self. Who is going to vote? Who is qualified to vote? Do you allow the settler population in to participate in that vote? It's the same story as the Kanak story that we talked about in the earlier part of the day. How do you define the self to exercise determination? And that is a challenge. And the second question is, after you have defined the self, are you really sure that you're going to win the election? And if you lose, then what happens? Well, the Canadian experience in the French sector of Canada, what was that, Quebec?
Yeah, Quebec.
They lost the election. But what did they say? Someone said, well, you already took a bite of the apple, so you can't vote again. And the response was, the right to self-determination is not an apple. It's a continuing human right that cannot be squashed. And you have the right to do it over and over and over again. I think it was Thomas Jefferson. I don't remember him particularly, but I think it was he who said, every generation deserves a revolution. There's nothing wrong with a revolution of thought. Let the people decide. The next point was this idea of some sort of augmented, was it the word augmented?
Federalism?
Asymmetrical federalism.
That's what they call it.
Okay, and
I've heard it myself. So.
and my point is that you have to distinguish between autonomy and independence. Autonomy is based on the controlling government conceding that you can do this or you can do that. That's not independence, and let's be very clear about it. There's nothing wrong with autonomy, and if that is what the people want, just to be sort of half independent, so that's okay. But I think it's important to first recognize that there is a distinction between the two. And there's a situation in Panama, the Kuna Indians. They are autonomous. They're so autonomous that what the Panamanian Constitution says is that the Kuna Indians have the special right within the constitutional structure to develop their own relations with foreign countries. The right to develop your foreign relations is very important and oftentimes preserved by the central government, one of the principal controls. But Panama, or the Kuna Indians, can exercise that self-determination and trade with whoever they want to. In fact, you had some of that element with regards to some of the Indian organizations here in California, especially with regards to trading with, I think it was tobacco, until, who was that? Was it Chief Seattle or I forget his name, who had to escape from Canada because the Americans got tired of it and went out and tried to arrest him. The Canadian says, no, we are not going to turn him over. And then they gave in and they turned him over, I understand. If my facts are correct.
Maybe Chief Joseph the Nez Perce.
No, it wasn't that name.
It wasn't Jacques Matee?
No.
Okay, I'll quit up.
Well, I may be mistaken too. It's been many years since I've been more actively involved in the indigenous aspect of the arguments there. So, autonomy is another area. And then the fourth area I think you mentioned was economic assertion. To simply go out and assert yourself, treat yourself, irrespective of what the American law says. Say you're going to engage in, you're going to sign the Paris, what is that? All of those agreements. Then assert yourself, join in. Now the United States government will protest, but that's okay. What governs is the economic power behind the ability to carry out your actions. And now people are looking at the issue of sovereignty as not all that important. It's more what your economic power is. And that is going to move people. I want to point out that there was a very interesting commission back about 50 years ago when I was a young man in Alaska. The Alaska Independence Commission, I think it was called, and it was formed by the Alaskan legislature to study the issue of the viability of independence. And they formed their commission. That's another commission that the California or a group of you may want to create a commission so people will start paying attention to. And then address the question, what is the viability of economic independence for California? How can we do it? What would be the pros? What would be the cons? The conclusion that Alaska came out with was that they would be far better off as an independent nation than being stuck to the United States, except for one problem. And what was that problem? There was this thing called loyalty. Loyalty of the American citizens in Alaska who did not want to break away from Alaska. Okay. What is loyalty? Loyalty is nothing more than familiarity. When you come down to it, loyalty is nothing more than familiarity. You are loyal to your family. Why? Not because they are right or wrong or they stand for certain principles that you like as opposed to another family, but because of your familiar. That is how loyalty develops. We need to start training our people to be familiar with our own rights, our own destination, to change that familiarity and talk about other issues, what you can be loyal to. Why are we loyal to the United States of America? Because we have been taught to repeat and repeat and repeat, to recite a Pledge of Allegiance which we really don't understand, but we just recited it as if it was a prayer from elementary school. And yet we allowed it to sink into our psyche without really thinking about it. Well, perhaps we should develop a new recitation of allegiance. Okay, I just raised that as another,
that's good.
as another issue. Let's see what other notes I have. Oh, let me point out, yes, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has not been signed by the United States. But the thing is, it's not a declaration where you sign. It's not a treaty. It's a statement.
Yeah.
Every country in the world voted, or I should put it the other way, no country in the world voted against it. It is regarded as common international law today because it was so universally accepted. So you could take that and you can argue that it is part of the international law of civil society. The U.S. Supreme Court has said all civil societies are supposed to follow international law. There's your hypocrisy. Or it's a confession that the United States is maybe not really a civil society, which is what Martin Luther King was talking about. I want to point out here, if I may, just a short deviation. Oftentimes we talk about civil rights, and we get caught up with civil rights. What is civil rights when you compare it with human rights? Martin Luther King, a student of Mahatma Gandhi. Martin Luther King talked about a civil society in which civil rights will not allow discrimination among its people. It's a civil society. Everyone should have these basic rights, civil rights. How do you distinguish that from what Mahatma Gandhi was talking about? He was not talking about merely civil rights. He was talking about human rights, the right of all nations to stand equal, of all people to be equal among one another, to be able to stand at the United Nations with your flag there, just like every other flag. That's human rights. So never be satisfied just for civil rights for Californians. It's good, but it's not enough. If you are arguing for independence, it's the right of all peoples. But again, you're going to face a problem. How do you define your people? At what point is there a cutoff, or is there a cutoff? Is it defined by race? Is it defined by an oath of allegiance to certain principles? And so that, I think, is still part of the challenge of California.
I think I would say it's defined a lot by culture, by cultural similarities between Californians.
I think culture is very important, but also I think another aspect of the definition is the hope for the future. And to define that, we want to be able to control how we trade with others, how we deal with others, how we trade or how we deal with our environment. What is sacred to us as opposed to anyone else? We determine that. And it's not necessarily to judge others and say whether they are right or wrong. That's not the question. It's just that we want to assert who we are by that type of declaration. And that can only come about through, as I said in an earlier remark that I made, through conversation, through discussion, through the stages of decolonization, the third stage being the stage of dreaming, the fourth stage being the stage of consensus, and the fifth stage, the stage of action. So remember that decolonization is not simply getting the colonizer out of territory and now you take over. Because if that's all it is, then you leave the whole belief system within the territory. You leave what I call the DIE system, domination, individualism, and exclusion. And what happens there? You have a dogfight afterwards, and you have overthrow after overthrow after overthrow. This is the same thing that happened in Africa and all the independent nations, and in the Pacific and all independent nations, because they did not take the time to really sit down, converse, and try to reach agreed upon dreams for the future. That is so necessary. Otherwise, you relegate your people to continuing fights and being upset with one another. Not too good, not too sweet. Okay, I have a number of other comments, but I've said the basic aspect of the comments I wanted to give. I thank you very much for giving me the time to share some of my opinions. Mahalo.
Yeah, take my chair down.
And then we'll go next, and you can take your chair.
No.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel privileged because I'm getting two bites of the apple on this discussion. But first, I want to let everyone, for the record, to know that I was working on my telephone while he was speaking for the simple reason I had nothing else to write with. Wasn't sending out texts to anybody saying this guy is saying snide things. I do not live tweet people or snark.
We figured.
Okay. And I'm going to try to say something which I think is ultimately going to be actually uplifting and idealistic and surprising. But I'll start by getting to the specific. Canada, I would say, it was a poor example, but it's true, of course, that they did in fact evolve into an independent country gradually from about 1867, the Dominion Act, to I believe under Trudeau, the first Trudeau in 1972, which is when they adopted the maple leaf and they officially no longer became under the rule of the Queen and the British monarch and things like that. Right. In the process, I might point out to you, they were so much a part of the British Empire that they wound up in World War I and World War II from the beginning. I mean, literally the first day of the wars of Great Britain. And many a Canadian, and of course not to criticize any Canadian, but the truth is that many Canadian wound up fighting in a battle that they may not have understood what the world they were there for, but solely because their country just happened to be under the government of another country. And so they were often France fighting in Vimy Ridge or Passchendaele or the Somme or Gallipoli. Well, yes. Or Jerusalem. Or on and on. Yeah, the British. That war is that's why we call World War II people. It wasn't just the trenches. So that was one thing I say. So sorry here, I've got a darn phone. I got it on. Next thing. But as far as war goes, the reason why I don't think Canada also works is because Canada was not breaking free of Great Britain because they had a disagreement with Great Britain. There's a fundamental unity of policies. It was just simply an understanding that maybe it's made more sense to govern Canada and Australia and New Zealand locally rather than every law being passed from Parliament in Westminster in Britain. And may I point out further that Parliament I think the official way it went was when the Canadian Parliament passed a law. It was not going to be valid until it was given the assent by the Governor General, who was the official representative of the monarch.
Oh, yeah.
In other words, it's a little bit like what we have here, where, in a sense that we have a number of laws in this state of California which are only valid because the United States government has approved them. So but I'm going to actually just restart my. I'm going to do this now. I'm going to take my phone off of power saving. That's what I'm going to do, so I can just keep blanking out of me. So that's one thing. So as a result, right? But so in a result, there was not the same thing. We're talking about a revolt, a separation, because we don't agree with Washington's policies. And that is what, unfortunately, it's different. That's why it's not going to be. It might be consensual, and I have a theory it might be consensual only because California has so many minorities, so many gays, so many other people who aren't likely to vote Democratic, that the Republicans might choose to, say, yeah, sure, why don't you get out? But I don't know. The next thing I'll point out is we've always been assuming somehow that a civil war is just not going to, that we'd start the Civil War. I don't know. Every single day every single week or so, I see somebody a whole lot more influential than me saying something about civil war, and they're right-wingers. Now, when they say civil war, remember, they're not talking too much about. They really mean using force in order to gain power.
Yes.
Right?
Coup.
You call it a civil war, but you guys call it a coup, or I'd call it a revolt or whatever. But the key is using force in order to achieve political goals. And in a country that is already being operated under a constitution, on a functioning government and a constitution. So, in other words, and I've said this many times, we have to really consider that we may not control our fate to a significant extent, that we may be forced into independence because the alternative to it is just too horrible to accept. Okay? The speech I didn't get a chance to deliver, but I'll just mention briefly. Today is the 7th of December. And I believe that if we had a lesson from Pearl Harbor, the real one, not the vainglorious American triumphal one, like, we won, we would realize the reason why Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor really comes down to the fact that the Japanese people lost their freedom, lost their power over their own government, because the decisions were made by a few violent, rather ignorant people who, chose to choose, rather than engaging with the world in a peaceful and consensual way, they chose to seek, they went to war, and they went to war with 3 major countries at once. And I think that, because remember, Japan was a democracy up into the 1920s easily. And I guess one more thing I will point out is, why did they lose their freedom? They lost their freedom because one was because the government was relatively conservative, and they passed draconian public safety laws, rather like our Patriot Act.
Yeah.
They even created a secret special hire police, the Toko. And the phrase thought crime?
Yeah.
Right, which we think of from Orwell? No, the Japanese invented that. You were guilty of thought crime. But they only used it against socialist liberals and communists and trade unionists and whatever. And on the other hand, military officers who even shot the prime minister and killed them. They actually killed one prime minister. They killed a second. One was and they killed a lot of people and effectively forced a lot of people, including Isoroku Yamamoto, the admiral, into silence. They knew they were going to lose this war, but they knew they couldn't stop it. Even the Emperor of Japan was afraid of being overthrown if he tried to stop it. But the other piece is the media. The media, starting about 1931, when there was a free press, reported, did not decry what was going on in the country. Insisted that socialists and communists were much more of a threat than these officers were just, strong-willed people doing their best to serve the emperor, and so on and so on and so on.
Make Japan great.
Well, where have I heard or seen that before?
Yeah, exactly. But as I said, that tells us that as much as we love our democracy, as much as we believe in that, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, democracies fall.
Pin drop.
Right? They rise, but then they fall. And Germany had maybe a rather chaotic democracy, but they had a democracy. France had a democracy that almost turned into a fascist state during the 1930s. Great Britain had the comical example of Sir Oswald Mosley.
Yeah.
But here's a little thought concern. What if Winston Churchill had not been so committed to democracy as he was? He had popularity that Mosley didn't have. And yet he was still kind of an outsider, outspoken, kind of militaristic. Certainly didn't think much for Gandhi. Call him a fakir, etc. Just this thing about how that's actually the real question. Like, how could Germany have won the war? Avoid the war. How do you avoid the war? You have a different government in Britain. So, anyways, just want to point out that. Now, there's actually this next point I want to make. The United States being a rogue state. Threatening to arrest international court judges and prosecutors is an example of the kind of behavior that can only be made by a country that has simply turned its back on the international order. Remember, it was an American president who proposed the League of Nations in 1917. And of course, San Francisco, thanks to Franklin Roosevelt, but also thanks to the good people of San Francisco, has the honor of being the foundation of the United Nations. Up until this point, it's been an imperfect thing. I agree. We can have great debates about whether the United States did the right thing with when Korea was invaded, or for that matter, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. To give you two examples of one state invading another state. But we have a situation where in the British speech, then what's in the White House is called the government.
Right.
And that government seems to be a pro-Russia, anti-liberal. And I want to point out that liberal, I think we should start realizing, really means you respect the rule of law, you respect the results of elections, you honor the people with their own judgment. Those are liberal principles, and I say that because Putin has said things like liberalism is dead or liberalism is on decline. That's what he means by liberalism. He's not talking about fine-haired divisions between Senator Warren on one side, Senator Sanders on the other. He's talking about real basic stuff, whether it's better to be under a dictatorship or under a democratic republic, or I should say just democracy, because of course our friends in Great Britain. So now yes, we under those circumstances, I see our struggle as being one of preserving that last light of hope that we are in. That we're at 1939, and we have to think. The world is organizing to oppose this idea that